Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Laura DeNardis, the interim dean of the School of Communication at American University, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to this special event featuring author and BBC journalist Jon Sopel on his new book, Unpresidented: Politics, Pandemics, and the Race That Trumped All Others. I'm very eager to hear more about his stunning experiences as a reporter on the presidential campaign and election in 2020. Now, complicating this election, in addition to the pandemic, protests, polarization, and so much else, were heightened battles around digital media, the circulation of disinformation in social media, ongoing questions about foreign election interference attempts, the amplification of conspiracy theories, violent extremism, threats against journalists, and even the question of when a sitting American president can be blocked on social media. Let me just say, what a time to be a journalist around the world. Now, Jon, I want to mention to you that so many of our journalism students are attending this event this evening, and this past election year has been extraordinary for them also. Students worked on election-related investigations at the Washington Post in our course that's called the Washington Post Practicum, under the supervision of our faculty member, Jon Sullivan. They traveled to 2 primary states to cover the elections in the presidential primaries class. And COVID didn't stop them from tackling breaking news stories, in some cases from their living rooms, just like working journalists do. Supreme Court hearings, no problem. They filed on deadline, just like everyone else. It really has been incredible. Now, some of our students worked on, with one of our professors, Sherry Williams, launching Vision 2020 election stories from the Next Generation project in partnership with The Nation magazine that tried to magnify concerns of young voters from diverse experiences and backgrounds. So they've been on track with you and very much involved in this. And we're still counting, but at least a half dozen AU alums are right now in the White House press corps. So 5 of them from the School of Communication. We're really excited about that. They are thrilled, as well as all of our participants tonight. And thank you all for joining us. We're thrilled to have Jon here to share his experiences. The School of Communication is delighted to be co-hosting this event with the Sine Institute of Policy and Politics at American University. And moderating tonight's discussion is American University's very own Amy Dacey, the Executive Director of the Sine Institute. And Amy, I'd like to introduce you, if I may. Amy is no stranger to campaigning and elections, having served as the Chief Executive Officer of the Democratic National Committee during the 2016 presidential election. She worked for then Senator John Kerry on his presidential campaign in 2004 and has had a host of leadership positions, too numerous to mention, but I'll just mention one, the Executive Director of Emily's List, the organization that is dedicated to electing Democratic women to public office. So we're just so thrilled to have her at American University. And I ask you to help me welcome Amy Dacey, who will moderate this event and introduce our wonderful speaker.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nardis. We're so happy that you're here with us today. It's been such a great partnership with the School of Communications. And of course, as always, it's great to hear what our students are doing, on campus. It was definitely quite the year. I know that Jon has covered so many elections. He has been the BBC's North American editor since 2014, and he's covered the 2016 and 2020 elections and the Trump White House. So his perspective has been so, incredible. He's also written several other books on elections and ones that have mattered. We're going to certainly dig deep in today into his most recent book. And please go to the chat. We have information if you haven't gotten the book yet. Unprecedented. It's incredible. Can you tell? I did read it, Jon. I took a few minutes to mark important moments to talk about. It was incredible. And Dr. DeNardis, you can appreciate as well. This was an incredible piece of work to go back and talk about such an incredible election year. It was a little tough to read, Jon, because it was literally going through a diary that you had of a day to day what was happening in this year, and things came back to me that I was like, did that also happen in 2020? It was unbelievable. So we are so grateful to have you here to get your perspective. I certainly want to start out and talk a little bit about the book and how it's set up. I mean, the book covers the time period of June 18th, 2019 to November 7th of 2020. As you mentioned, that's 503 days before, as you call it, polling day, or as we call it, election day. I think it was geared, certainly toward observers in London and England. A lot of it's written for consuming, in that country to know more about our elections, and it brings us a perspective from both sides of the pond. And I think in an interesting way, this was really set up as an election diary, but so much of this was about the administration and the incredible, unprecedented things that were happening. I just want to first start by welcoming you and getting your general observations. When we start, on June 18th, there's no global pandemic. I think the economy is doing not well for everyone, but certainly in a way, looked at by a strength by the Trump administration. The social unrest we saw later in the next summer had not started. It was a very different world, I think, in June 18th. And so, what were your expectations when you started writing this book and were thinking about how you were going to document a presidential election year?
Amy, it's a great opening question. I just want to say thank you, all of you, for tuning into this. In London, which is where I'm actually in London at the moment, so it's quite late at night here. In London, there you have no other options because all the pubs are shut, all the bars are closed, the restaurants. London, Britain is in lockdown, whereas you have options in DC. So thank you very much indeed for being part of this. I mean, the book was conceived with my publisher and a literary agent, and they said, why don't you do a diary of the election? Because, and I thought it would all be planes, trains, and automobiles of endless kind of regional airports in Des Moines late at night, trying to get to New Hampshire or trying to get to South Carolina or then getting to Nevada and then Super Tuesday. And, and it would be that sort of book that would unfold. And of course, it turned out to be a very different book than I'd intended to write. It became much more personal because suddenly my wife had to move back to London because she's got a very, very elderly mother. My son lives in Australia because he's married an Australian. And suddenly everything is dislocated and all the wiring that keeps the world together has been ripped from the wall. And you can't move around, and the pandemic has come in and it upends everything. And in Orlando, where Donald Trump launched his presidential re-election bid in 2019, the world seemed set fair for him. The economy was doing pretty well. Approval ratings were never high for him. People were spending money again. Tax cuts, yes, they disproportionately helped the very wealthy, but some money was coming through. There was a growing confidence on Main Street, and to an awful lot of his supporters, whether you liked what he was offering or not, he sort of had stuck to his word. He had started building a wall. He was keeping immigrants out. He was making it much more difficult for Muslims to get into the country. He sort of was bringing back manufacturing, but not in the way that it was hyped. And, you know, he was looking like he'd made a big down payment on what he pledged the American people in 2016. And I thought it's going to take someone absolutely formidable to beat him. And he looked very, very strong indeed. And as you say, Amy, the book is written as a diary. And there were bits where I kind of make massive misjudgments about the significance I attach to certain events and think, can I go back and rewrite that to make myself look really, really clever and just so prescient and so smart? And I thought, no, I can't do that. The rules are that I write as I see it. There are some bits where I think I am kind of moderately on the money. My early remarks about Joe Biden in January and February, not so much.
Well, I think that's one of the greatest things about this book is that it is just, it goes back and hasn't, there's honestly how this evolved over time and how our perceptions very beginning of this election cycle changed. And like you said, we're upended. I think one of the most interesting things, as you pointed out, when you started 503 days out, we didn't know who the Democratic nominee was going to be. And it was a very crowded field for you know, the Democrats in their primary, and coming off a very challenging election year in 2016. So, I mean, I found myself, I mean, John, I knew the ending, but I found myself like ripping through the pages because it was like compelling, and it was going back and thinking, I think it makes the reader think, what were my perceptions at that point in the election cycle too, which I think is very important because we didn't know then what we know now on a lot of things.
And also, I honestly think that one of Donald Trump's great insights into politics is that people's memories are incredibly short. Because if people's memories were long, then my goodness, there was an awful lot to take into account when judging Donald Trump. And I think he just thought, you know, so when we got to impeachment January 2020, you think, oh, nothing can possibly eclipse impeachment 2020.
Yeah.
Oh, it can. Oh, and it does. And then the pandemic comes along, and the murder of George Floyd and the protests that followed from that. And Donald Trump all the time is thinking, people will forget. People will forget. And I think what is useful about the book is to take you back and revisit some of those seismic events that were unfolding. And actually, you know, if I was to make one general observation, which people can take or they can't, you know, I think the pandemic provided Donald Trump with a unique opportunity to win the election hugely, become the father of the nation, the healer, bind people's wounds, follow the scientific advice, tuck in behind Anthony Fauci as this kind of trusted figure who would lead America from this horrible, horrible situation, give people consistent advice. And how can you lose with, you know, and of course, I don't think the pandemic cost Donald Trump the election. I think it's the way he handled the pandemic that cost him the election. And you know, maybe we'll talk about this, but I was in the briefing room when that night when he talked about maybe you could inject yourself with bleach or whatever it is, Clorox, to deal with coronavirus, because it seems to kill it stone dead on surfaces. Amy, I just as an aside, because I got home that night and thought that was the craziest thing I have ever been to in my life. And I guess being the public relations officer, the comms guy for Clorox is not that interesting a job. I mean, what is the press release you're writing? We have now got a rose-scented Clorox that we are going to be marketing from April. That night, the press officer sits at his terminal and he's tapping away saying, whatever you do not believe a single word the president has said. This will kill you. And that is the press release I got the next morning. And I thought, we are living in the craziest of times.
There's so many of those moments that we relive in the book where you say this, and thus the name, but it's like, can you believe this happened at one point? Just to encourage everybody in the Q&A function, please put your questions. We'll try and get to them, all as we go. But I think a lot of this is in flow, because George already asked the question, but for the pandemic, would Donald Trump have won. And I think one of the interesting things is you talked about his character a lot, his style a lot through this book, because obviously you not only covered the 2016 election, you saw his leadership style in office. And I think that's one of the things that you clue us into early on too, this how he's going to handle this. I think one of the interesting passages early on, you mentioned that he's always had this foe. It was fight against Hillary, or when you saw in the primaries, it was Cruz, and suddenly, I guess I would ask you as a big picture question, was Donald Trump running against Joe Biden once he was nominee, or was he running against the coronavirus? And is that a foe he's not used to because he can't do a personal attack?
Well, you can't call the coronavirus little COVID, or lying COVID, or crooked COVID. It doesn't have a Twitter account. It doesn't answer back. And he's swinging and missing.
Yeah.
Because how can you hit it? And I think that Donald Trump was presented with something that he had never considered and had never thought would be part of what would be the obstacles that would stop him winning an election in November 2020. And also, I think he found Joe Biden a very difficult enemy to have, because he was swinging and missing a lot. Sleepy Joe, that didn't people wanted someone who was going to lower the temperature. Crooked Joe didn't really work. But I do think what is interesting, and which is where I think that Donald Trump, the gut politician, he has a great visceral sense of power and threats. And he is a man who sees, he's not a man who sits at the top of the hill and enjoys the view. He is the man who is there looking around and thinking, who is trying to bring me down? And what led to his first impeachment? His first impeachment was because he looked at the Democratic field and thought the only person that represents a real danger to me is Joe Biden. So I'm going to send Rudy Giuliani off to find out what he can about this company that no one had heard of called Burisma, and get involved with a president who none of us have ever heard of called Volodymyr Zelensky, and the rest. And that's what led to it. It was fear of Biden from the outset. And that shows, for all the other shortcomings that maybe we'll talk about Trump's personality, his ego, his narcissism, whatever it is, he is very, very smart about sensing the power, where it lies, what the threats to it are, and what he needs to do.
Well, it's interesting. So I want to take a step back then a little bit more in the Democratic primary, because, that wasn't from the very beginning. It didn't look like, Biden was always going to be the nominee. Like I said, it was a crowded field. I think one of the very interesting parts in the book, that you mention is November 24th, Bloomberg jumps into the race. And again, it's interesting to me because of your perspective of what kind of businessman is Trump, and where does he see the threat, personally. Having followed the whole primary, do you think there was one person that he was more concerned about than others, or did he have in his mind a way to take down each one as the Democrats were trying to figure out who their nominee would be?
I think he was certainly spooked by the entry into the race of Michael Bloomberg, because, Donald Trump likes to sell himself as the very smart billionaire. Well, Bloomberg is probably smarter and very, very much more of a billionaire than Donald Trump. And that was one of the great Bloomberg quotes. There were disastrous Bloomberg moments, but when he said, what do you feel about there being two billionaires in the race? And Bloomberg said, who's the other one? And it was just one of those very witty, kind of sharp comments that would have triggered the president. I think that Bloomberg looked good until he came up against Elizabeth Warren in that debate. I think it was in Las Vegas, and he was just absolutely taken to pieces. And it was, I do think that, the joy for me, having covered Westminster politics for many years, which, Amy, is where you and I first met each other when you'd come over to observe a British general election, was just how brutal American politics is and what a blood sport it is. And, there are times when I think, oh, I can't watch. And, there was sort of Elizabeth Warren's treatment of Bloomberg was one of those sort of moments. Look, it was very unclear. Pete Buttigieg was making a lot of early, and he did incredibly well in Iowa. And you thought, well, maybe, is this going to be the Obama rerun from 2008? Is this the guy that, people is going to, and I think then Biden came fifth. I mean, it was appalling. And also the running of the Iowa caucus, which is a kind of curiosity of a quirk of electioneering of, that this small Midwestern state has this disproportionate power and, and this caucusing system. And you think, sorry, I've now got my job as the BBC's North America editor to try to explain the methods of a caucus to a UK audience.
I noticed didn't go in depth in the book because it is a very complicated system. And with a lot of what they were trying to do digitally, I mean, when you look at the book, a lot of what we talk about is definitely the general election, but that primary was so unprecedented in some ways because, as you point out, is there a new playbook for a nominee where you don't have to win the first two contests?
Yeah.
And then you come through. And an interesting thing, it's a year anniversary today of the actual South Carolina debate. So this is not why we picked the date necessarily, but like it's an interesting, and you make a lot in the book talking about South Carolina and as a turning point and how that really changed the dynamics early on. And certainly Trump and his campaign team are watching all of this unfold, but the turning point of South Carolina, what do you think that meant to the election, both in the primary and then in the general?
So no, I don't need to lecture. I mean, you'd had Iowa. Mm-hmm. You've had New Hampshire. New Hampshire was also catastrophic for Joe Biden. He had turned up there in the Granite State. He had done absolutely appallingly and left before the results had been declared. And you thought, this is the last stand of Joe Biden. South Carolina is the last opportunity you have got. And if you can't do well here, you're finished. And it didn't look great for him. It didn't look like he had a whole lot going for him in South Carolina. And then, of course, the congressman intervenes, the kind of very, very well-known, hugely respected congressman from there comes in, and the black vote turns out for Joe Biden, and he wins. And suddenly, in a moment, the whole narrative is switched around. And by the time you get to Super Tuesday, you're saying, is there anything that can stop Joe Biden? Realistically, very soon after that, it became absolutely clear that Bernie Sanders would have to get out of the way. And he would be the stubborn, obstinate one who would stay for as long in the fight as he possibly could. But you felt it was absolutely inevitable. And then it was a case of the Trump campaign. And again, one of the things that, the extraordinary things about Trump's personality is he is possibly one of the most transparent politicians that I have ever reported on in my long, tedious career, kind of fun career. We know what he thinks on any given moment. His Twitter feed, he cannot hide his emotions. I bet he'd be an awful, appalling poker player. Because if he's gleeful, he's gleeful. And if he's overbearing, he's overbearing. And if he's smarting, he's smarting. And if he's sulky and sullen, he's sulky and sullen. And you know exactly where he is. And him trying to play Joe Biden and saying, Joe, you're being treated terribly. I wouldn't put up with this. Don't get out of the race. I thought conveyed his real fear that Biden was the greatest danger, and he wanted Bernie to feel angry, and he wanted Bernie's supporters to feel that they had been robbed and therefore might not go out to vote, and he was trying to drive down turnout. So some of what I think Donald Trump does is visceral, it's gut, it's instinctive, it's impulsive, often getting him into trouble. But I think there's cleverness, smartness there too.
Well, it's interesting because if you want to talk about the impact of the pandemic on message-wise on both these campaigns, because we do see, President Biden, he does get the nomination. But it was March 10th when in 2020 when Sanders and Biden start canceling their event because of the reality of the impending pandemic. And I think this is the beginning of the virtual campaign. And I think if one of the things is a takeaway, seeing, former colleagues, seeing peers of mine that are actually on the campaigns, having to deal with pivoting immediately to a virtual campaign, to organizing in a virtual way. Did it benefit some and not others? I mean, certainly you talk about Trump being out there, where his strengths are at these rallies and whatnot, Biden in some of these more smaller, intimate, conversations. Like, what impact did the virtual campaign have in both those, for both nominees?
Just before I come to that, I went with Biden. I was part of the reporter pool, and I was on Air Force One. Was it only last week? Yeah, last week when we went to Milwaukee. Mm-hmm. And Biden did the town hall on CNN. And I was suddenly struck by there are huge differences between Joe Biden and Donald Trump. But one thing just clarified for me. Trump loves a crowd. He needs a crowd. Biden loves people. Mm. And there is a huge difference between the two. Biden gets a question from a member of the audience and says, "Oh, you're a teacher, fantastic. What are you teaching? What age group are you teaching?" And they've got to, "Oh, your daughter's there. Oh, fantastic. And what are you doing? How are you coping? How are you getting on?" Very empathetic, very kind of, and he locks eyes onto you and he does it brilliantly. And very good friends of mine in America, their son has a terrible stammer. And Joe Biden has sort of been involved. And I've seen Joe Biden up close doing that sort of stuff. And he is absolutely brilliant. Donald Trump needs a crowd. So in the early days of Brexit, in the early days, you see, this is me coming back to London. What happens to my brain is it flips back into UK issues. In the early days of the pandemic, Trump is denied rallies. He is denied foreign heads of state visiting. Mm-hmm. So for the first time in his presidency, he comes into the briefing room on a daily basis, which has been cleared largely because of COVID concerns, and the White House Correspondents Association doing a great job of trying to keep people safe. It's only got 12 people in it. So on the days when I was there, and I was there quite often because the BBC is, I don't know, we seem to be held in some regard. We are there pretty regularly. It's like you're having a private audience with Donald Trump. And it didn't work for him because Donald Trump wants adulation. He doesn't want pernickety, difficult questions from pesky people like us. He wants to be given a free ride. And I suddenly realized that, to use the obvious metaphor, Donald Trump needed oxygen and we were his ventilator. Was there ever a worse matched relationship between us, the journalists, as the ventilator, and Donald Trump needing that oxygen? And so he would come in and he would talk for 2 hours. He would say all sorts of, like the day he came in and talked about injecting sunlight and injecting disinfectant into the body. And it all went wrong. And so that did not serve Trump's purposes well. If in April, May, June, July, Donald Trump was talking to 35,000 people at rallies, and Joe Biden was having to compete with him because, of course, there'd have been Democrat rallies, Trump would have won hands down. There would not have been 35,000 people turning up to see Joe Biden speak. So I think it worked. Joe Biden in his basement in Wilmington with a face mask on worked perfectly. I mean, it could not have been scripted better for him because he played to his strengths of talking to small groups. That's tick. He didn't have to say too much. He could let, as one of, I met a Republican strategist who said, if your opponent is committing suicide, there is no need to murder him. And
that's one of the quotes I was going to mention, from the book, because it was like, you talk about these press conferences where he goes out and there's a lack of empathy about the virus. there's not deference to the scientific leaders around him that are trying to make those deferences. And it did give Biden the space to show a leadership style that was very different, and certainly say, how would I be handling this crisis in a different manner?
You see, I think if it had been a conventional election of conventional campaigning, Trump would have been attracting huge crowds, Biden much less so. The aging process has been kinder to Donald Trump in terms of vim and vigor, I think, than it has been to Joe Biden. Maybe at the end there should have been more campaigning, on the streets campaigning, of canvassing and knocking on doors, that I don't think the Democrats did enough of at the end. But I think for the most part, it all played into Joe Biden's hands.
Let me ask you this, like, as a journalist, was that frustrating? Did you feel like you had access to voters? I think about important pivotal moments, conventions where you talk to the party, certainly party leaders from across the country. And then you also go into those diners and those local places, you
Yeah.
travel to the battleground states. How did that affect your reporting? And was it a challenge for you to get the pulse of what was happening, but also to report on the sentiment?
Yeah, it was challenging. It was difficult because you haven't got you're there with a rusty old compass and you're trying to find magnetic north, and you're tapping this thing, and you're hoping you're going to find a way and understand what is the narrative and what is driving all of this. And it was immensely frustrating not to be able to. But as the time went on, in the last 2 months of the campaign, I traveled quite a lot, and I was seeing polls showing Biden 14 points up in Pennsylvania. We went to Bethlehem in Pennsylvania, and we were through the Lehigh Valley and all the rest of it. And where are these people? Where are the defectors? And I'm ringing up the Democratic Party and saying, okay, look, we're doing this piece. We're from the BBC. You've got this huge poll lead. Can you connect me? We'd love to interview some people who voted for Trump in 2016, who are now voting Biden in 2020. And they couldn't find any. And so I suddenly thought, this is not going to be the blowout that some people had started talking of, because that didn't seem possible. It just didn't seem conceivable given what we were hearing. And then you go down to Florida, and I spent quite a bit of time in Florida. And again, polls showing Biden ahead. And I thought, wow, this is no way is this the case. And going down to Miami-Dade and speaking to the head of the Democrats down there, who says, this is not the reality. The thing that Trump has done brilliantly is that he has managed to persuade a lot of Hispanic voters that Joe Biden is a socialist, that he is a quasi-Marxist, that he's going to introduce all these measures that will, all the stuff that you fled your homeland from. You fled Cuba, you fled Nicaragua, you fled Honduras, whatever. Biden is going to introduce it here. And there was, and it was no surprise that on election night that Trump won Florida, and the Hispanic vote was much stronger for Trump in 2020 than it was in 2016. Hillary Clinton did far better in Florida than Joe Biden did. So so we did get out in a bit, and you realize that the patchwork, the patchwork tapestry of America was much more nuanced and complicated than the headline figures of the polls. And I think we'd all got a little bit after 2016 wary of believing the polls too much, because Trump was able to bring people who were seemingly off the grid onto the grid.
Well, it's interesting because Deborah brings up a question. You mentioned our memories are so much shorter with this election, but she brings up a good point. Was there anything that Donald Trump could have done to have his followers vote against him? He got 4 million more votes than he did in 2016. So again, Biden did win, but some of the just the way the electorate reacted was very interesting, I think.
The hold that Donald Trump has on his base is unbelievable. That he can do no wrong. And at first I sort of, if I was to take an arc of this over 4 years, you know, when I first started reporting on Trump rallies, and the first one I went to, I think, was in August 2015. So again, well over a year out from the 2016 election. And it was at the American Airlines Arena in Dallas. And I could not believe how many thousands of people have come up. And it's a fiesta atmosphere. They've come in costumes, they've come dressed up. They loved and adored him. They couldn't buy enough tat from the street vendors of scarves and Make America Great Again hats and all the rest of it. And that carried on and on and on and on. And you know, so it reached a stage where I did think that Donald Trump can do no wrong with his base, but can he nudge it up? And you know, what was so clear to me in the 2020 election was this negative partisanship. Mm-hmm. That people didn't particularly like Joe Biden, but he was slightly bland, he was a bit innocuous, he was regular. If you've had, with Donald Trump, you've been on a long car journey where it's been on heavy metal station with the volume turned up to 10. And people have just think, my ears are bleeding. I want the volume turned down to 7 and I want something easy listening. And Joe Biden fitted that category better than anyone else in the Democratic field. He was reassuring, he was grown up, he was empathetic, he was calm, he was measured, he wasn't going to crash wasn't going to drive the car over a cliff. And it wasn't that people loved Joe Biden, but the problem for Donald Trump was huge numbers of people with this very divisive politics that kept his base absolutely together, meant that also equally those who didn't like Donald Trump loathed him. And that negative partisanship drove up turnout so that Biden got a record number of votes as well. And, you know, the old quote from Donald Trump, I could go onto Fifth Avenue and kill someone and get away with it. Yeah, except it came to January the 6th. And I don't think that people will ever, you know, if I've always sort of slightly bought into the truism in politics that people are remembered for one thing. And I think Donald Trump will be remembered for the riots in Washington, D.C. and the attempted insurrection.
Well, that's interesting because we do get to this point. It's May 26th in the book that you mentioned that the Minneapolis video of the murder of George Floyd comes out. This is something that over the summer certainly becomes a part of the narrative of what's happening, even in the way it was characterized almost, you know, this culture war. Donald Trump wasn't winning with the economy. He was having trouble battling this virus, and then became this law and order question. What were they protests? Were they riots? This is what really led the narrative. How did you view this as a journalist coming from England to look at what was happening to America over the summer during this national election?
It was pretty depressing. I mean, you know, if America's original sin was racism, here it was again. And the same old issues that you hope you've made progress on are really stirring resentment. And I thought initially that all the time the debate is there racism in the police? Is there black people treated unfairly? Is there a brutality? Then Donald Trump loses that argument. And it was almost, you could imagine the palpable relief inside the White House when rioting started. And he goes, phew, we can make this about law and order, and we can make it about the mob, and we can make it about, and that's where he tried to reposition the debate. And the threat to the suburbs, which I always thought was one of those very curious dog whistle type arguments that was made, where you're saying, yeah, your suburbs are going to be overrun by the inner cities. And you think, what are you trying to say there? Are you trying to say that black people are going to overrun your white suburbs? And I just thought it was a very binary way that the president was trying to argue that at the time. And I think that poses challenges for reporting. You've got a lot of journalism students on this tonight. I think that, you know, one of the things in the BBC is that, you know, is our impartiality. And I think people sometimes say that impartiality is you've got to say on the one hand and on the other. No. If someone says the earth is flat and someone else says the earth is round, you don't say, well, one says this and the other says that. Only time will tell who's right. Jon Sopel, BBC News, Washington. No, you say the earth is round. And I found that during the Trump presidency, increasingly, it started on day one of the presidency when he said that the crowd for my inauguration was the biggest in history, or Sean Spicer came to the briefing room that Saturday evening and I was there and said all this. And by the way, I was sitting next to the Guardian's correspondent in Washington, who used to be their man in Southern Africa. And he, when Sean Spicer stormed out without taking a question, having put forward this ridiculous proposition that the crowd for Donald Trump's inauguration was the biggest in history, he turned to me and goes, it's just like being back in Zimbabwe. And there were elements of that where we just had to call it out. And I think that as journalists, very calmly, without anger, without thinking that Donald Trump is the enemy, and I have to say that I have some criticism, dare I say it, of American media, who did take the attitude that Donald Trump was the enemy. The enemy are the Democrats or the Republicans, or in British political terms, the enemy to Boris Johnson of the Labour Party. It's not the media, it's not our job, but it is our job to hold power to account in a calm, reasoned way. And if something is said that is untrue, it's our job to say that is untrue. And we did that quite frequently. And the George Floyd, some of the things that were said and done by the president forced us to say that. And I think it was the right thing to do. And I think that came to a head. I'm jumping ahead, I know, but.
No, I think it's interesting because those are those moments that you look back in retrospect. There was one, when your journal entries on May 29th, you literally say, just think about it, a president of the US cautioned for inciting violence. Like, and then you see these things, unfold throughout the summer and then leading up to January 6th. But there was another point too where you also said, are we really going to silence somebody for, and so there's questions about how are we covering this? How are we treating this throughout the book?
Yeah.
Which I think were really, especially at those moments as it progressed, that were really important.
Yes, and I think these are really complicated and difficult issues. And you can't just give glib answers and say, look, I've always thought that my job as a journalist is important. And I think we do a vital job. And in America, it's much more respected because of the First Amendment. And we don't have anything quite like that in the UK. But given the misinformation and disinformation and downright lies, and you can start with the triviality of my crowd was bigger than Barack's at the start of 26, the beginning of 2017. And I had a run-in with Donald Trump came to Britain and talked about Brexit and said that he gave a news conference the day before Brexit happened at his golf course in Scotland and predicted that Brexit would happen, and how none of the journalists at this news conference on the 9th tee of his golf course believed a word he said. I was there. He did it the day after. And he arrived in Scotland the day after Brexit. He didn't predict anything. But Donald Trump kept on perpetuating this falsehood. So I went on Twitter after he'd said this at this news conference with Theresa May, the then British Prime Minister, and said how bizarre Donald Trump's doing this. And a White House official, Melania Trump's Director of Communications, Stephanie Grisham, takes me on and says, he was there. And I said, look, here's the evidence. And eventually I found the flight manifest. I found the first Trump tweet and proved it. But that showed the willingness of a White House official to lie because that's what you needed to do to keep the president happy. Now, whether he was there the day before Brexit or the day after, who cares? Whether the crowd was bigger, who cares? An election being stolen, that matters. And that goes to the lifeblood of a democracy. And if, like me, you love liberal democracies, where broadly speaking, we have freedom of speech and the rule of law and freedom of association and all the other things that go with it that we sort of take for granted, a well-informed electorate is vital to that. And at the moment, I think the threats to having a well-informed electorate, when you have so many forces that are telling people just what they want to hear. And so journalism it sometimes felt in the US in 2020 was less about informing than affirming. You are there to affirm what people already believe. And I think that is poisonous for democracy, because I think we should be holding both sides to account, giving tough questions to both sides, and not thinking, right, well, I'm going to forgive this and I'm going to go along with the idea that the election was stolen. Because the election on any, this isn't me saying the election wasn't stolen. America has laws, it's a country of laws, and the laws are adjudicated by judges, and court cases were brought, and they failed. The legal system said the election was fair. The people who were charged with running the elections in the states were certifying the results. The Attorney General said it was fair, the then Attorney General, the person in charge of election security. So on every objective criteria, an election is seen to be fair, and yet 140 Republican congressmen and women from the vote against certification. And you think that is threatening. And that's what leads to events like January the 6th, where I went on our nightly news in the UK, our main show, and said, it feels to me that, and I couldn't believe I was saying these words, words I would never thought I would be expressing, but American democracy seems to be on the brink tonight. Because it did seem to be.
It's definitely a horrifying time. And although your book stops at November 7th, we can see this buildup. And, you bring up the point about authenticity, about, sharing the truth. And I've got to ask you, especially because poor Tom Spring is in Liverpool right now and asked a question. And so I have to give, somebody who's up in Liverpool a shout out. But he asked the question about the debates. And the debates have been traditionally a part of the campaign where you have to hear specifically from the candidates. That was unprecedented, as well. And, Tom wonders, is the moment where Joe Biden tells Donald Trump to shut up in the debate a big moment? But I think it also points to that first debate. The second one's canceled. The vice presidential debate, many would argue, is more important than it has in the past. Do debates still have a role? You've covered them in a few elections. That seems to me the pipeline to have an honest hear directly from the candidate. But are we losing that also?
I think the debates did have an effect. I think that first debate in Cleveland, where potentially, I don't know, we still don't know. We still don't know the answer to whether Trump had coronavirus at that debate. I think the madness of that first debate, the aftermath of it, Trump a couple of days later, it being announced at midnight or midnight 30 that he's contracted coronavirus, then him being carted off to Walter Reed. I was outside Walter Reed when he did his COVID joyride and came up and down Wisconsin Avenue outside in Bethesda. And I think, again, that, and then coming back to the White House and saying it was a blessing from God that he'd been given COVID, because anyone can beat this, it's so easy. When at that stage, I think 250,000 Americans had died. You just felt this is reassuring a lot of your base, but it's not winning over doubting Americans. And I think it was, again, going back, Amy, to an earlier answer about negative partisanship, I think the people who were the determination, the quiet, still determination of a lot of Americans who did not want to make a big fuss about their support for Joe Biden, and probably didn't have yard signs up because they thought it will just attract anger or whatever if you're living in a Trump area, is what led to Trump losing Arizona, Georgia, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania.
Well, it's interesting too, because you brought up that day and when the President Trump was diagnosed with coronavirus. You said it was October 2nd in the journal, and you said in 35 years of journalism, you've never seen a day like this. You start out the day, the First Lady are tested positive for coronavirus. The White House physician almost comes out in a PR way to talk about, what happened. Then suddenly he's fine, no symptoms, and then he's being rushed to Walter Reed. I mean, this all happened within a day.
It was unreal. And you realize that when Sean Conley, the physician, came out to do that briefing at Walter Reed, he wasn't addressing the American people. he wasn't addressing the world, though he was. He was addressing one person. It was Donald Trump. And what we have seen is the danger of a system where you, and it goes back to my earlier answer of the threats, that when you have got a hugely powerful person who the only truth that matters is the truth that he believes, and that there is no such thing as objective truth. I think there are facts, and they are stubborn, and they won't be shaped all the time to the way they're not as malleable as you'd like them to be. And I think that those things are very, very important for journalists. And I think it was our job to point these things out, even if the people around Donald Trump were too terrified. And I think that what happened in America in the run up to the election, where Donald Trump, they all thought, we'll be able to talk him round. We'll be able to talk him down off the ledge that he's got himself onto, or off the hook, if you like, to change the metaphor, that he's put himself on. And that we'll get him to accept that he lost the election, that it's all fine. And what happened was that fewer and fewer people were prepared to challenge Donald Trump. They just drifted away. And so you're left with the sort of scenes that took place at, Four Seasons Total Landscaping, or the press conferences with Sidney Powell and Rudy Giuliani with hair dye, and you're just left with people who are reinforcing those messages. But an awful lot of lawmakers who are still terrified of Donald Trump, and I suspect that we'll see at CPAC this weekend an awful lot of people just doffing their cap in a rather deferential way to Donald Trump, because they fear the damage that he can do, and that is going to be a continuing force in American politics. That Trump may be gone, but Trumpian style politics are going to be here for a lot longer yet, and Donald Trump still has considerable power over the Republican Party.
Yeah, and this is great that you answered that, because several people are asking what comes next. But I want to spend a minute with.
Can I just say that for me personally, what comes next? I feel for 4 years I have been smoking a crack pipe every night, and now with Joe Biden's presidency, I've got a small glass of white wine with soda and about 4 ice cubes in it. That is the difference between the two worlds that I've inhabited could not be more stark.
Yeah, that's quite a very vivid description, John. I wouldn't expect no less from you. It is interesting, though, when you're thinking about this, a question, you followed him for so long, President Trump. Do you think he really felt there was voter fraud, or this was another tactic to cause that division, that social unrest, that anxiety in the country to his electoral benefit?
I think he believes there was. I think one of the things I get right. So I get wrong Joe Biden in January and February of 2020, where I say he looks like some old heavyweight boxer who's been put into the ring for a last payday fight, and really the ref should just throw in the towel and say, go back to your corner. You're too old for this. That I get wrong. I do say quite early on that Trump only sees two outcomes of the election. This is months before polling day. One is he wins, two is it's stolen from him, and that he asserts fraud. And he was pretty consistent in doing all of that. And so I think he probably does believe. He cannot conceive. And the Trump supporters who were there on January the 6th, who I was down at the Ellipse on January the 6th when Trump gave that speech. And they're all saying to me, it's absolutely definite, there's stolen. And their argument for it was, are you telling me that Joe Biden got more votes than Barack Obama? Come off it. Can't be. It can't be the truth. And again, negative partisanship. They were driven by not wanting Donald Trump. Just as there was a section of the American public, and Amy, I know it's painful to revisit 2016, who were determined not to have Hillary Clinton for whatever reasons, for complex, not always worthy reasons, but didn't want Hillary Clinton. And so I suspect that Donald Trump does still believe, and he's never the greatest thing for American unity that could happen to lower the temperature and bring your wonderful country together, if I may say, I adore America, and I've been a great fan of it all my life. From when I was 8 years old and first came to New York and thought, oh my God, this is unbelievable. is for Donald Trump to say 2 words: I lost. And I don't think that's ever going to happen. And so the Republican Party has got to decide how it positions itself. And it's tough, because I don't believe that of that 140 who voted against certification, maybe there are 20 who believe that there was widespread fraud and have fully signed up to everything that Donald Trump has said. But I think the overwhelming majority are just thinking, if I don't say that, if I vote for certification, there's every chance I'm going to be primaried in the midterms. I don't want that. I'll go for quiet life. And there will come a point where the Republican Party will look at polling data and think, is following the Trumpian message going to get us to 2024 and to victory? And I think that's a very open question, particularly when Donald Trump still faces huge legal jeopardy.
Well, I think, you know, in an interesting way, as you mentioned, and because of this, but I mean, the world was watching. And, you know, here in the United States, we had election day. The media tried hard to forewarn everybody it's not going to be determined on election day. But the interesting part of the book is where you really journal and chronicle those days after the election up until November, 7th. I have to say that, a lot of our institutions were challenged. You even mentioned, it sounds like you didn't want to do anything for fear that next, you'd hear from John King about what, the next state that was called. And for somebody who, as you mentioned, I met you, we were over there, the election was decided, the prime minister was in the car and headed over to Buckingham Palace to form the new government. It was like this. I mean, how does the world see this long drawn out, and then the book stops at November 7th, but then we also have the transition. The transition was fraught with, was this election, valid or not, and for something to have that much turnout and then to go through that and lead up to January 6th. I mean, what does the world think of American democracy?
Well, I think that the world at various times has bought in, the Western world. Let me talk about the Western world. Let me talk about Europe. As a European, the biblical description of the shining city on the hill, the country that was formed with a blank sheet of paper and these brilliant people who drew up this constitution, the philosophers and the gentleman farmers who kind of came together to write this wonderful document. That we do look at America and want to, it feels like the big brother that's going to keep us all safe, that economically, militarily, diplomatically, yeah, it makes mistakes and, we can go back over time. But broadly speaking, since the Second World War, since 1945, America has been at the forefront of designing the architecture of the modern world, the World Trade Organization, the IMF, the United Nations, and the EU, European Union grew out of that, and of course NATO. And Donald Trump seemed to be pretty disenchanted with anything that was multilateral. And so I think the world has been very spooked by Donald Trump, and I'm talking in London, I'm talking Berlin, I'm talking Paris, I'm talking, the main powerhouses, and have felt that there has been something that has been very scary for those countries about a Trump presidency that is not just about America first. And, in terms of economic nationalism, I see bits of that in some of what Biden's talking about at the moment about, American jobs and the American worker and bringing back, jobs on shore and all that sort of things. Look, that's the Trumpian message. No one's frightened by that. It's just by the antipathy that seemed to be, particularly for NATO, which has sort of kept the pace pretty well in Europe for the past 70 years. And I think that frightened Europe. And I think that there was it was a huge story around the world. The events of the election and what followed, and January the 6th, and what happens now to America. And there was a fascination and a grip that you just thought, what is going to happen next? And that was felt as acutely around the world. I bumped into a senior diplomat who I know, a European diplomat, and this was 2 or 3 weeks ago. And I said to him, so come on, how does it compare? What's good, what's bad? And he said, well, I tell you what, it's fantastic. At the moment, we have got order, there is discipline, there is predictability, we have got a proper way of doing things. And I said, what's the downside? He said, there is order, there is discipline, there is predictability, and an ordered way of doing things. Because in the Trump presidency, the ambassador of wherever could probably ring up the White House and may well get put through to Donald Trump and not go through layers and layers and layers of people before you get there. I think overwhelmingly, people are thinking, not that it's going to be easy, but there is an ordered way of doing things again, which has been the norm, whether it's been a Republican or a Democrat president since 1945.
Well, Jon, I want to thank you. This flew by.
We can't be an hour done already.
It's already been an hour. We didn't even cover so many topics that we need to cover. I encourage everybody to get the book. It's in the link. And Jon, when we are back in person on campus, we're going to bring you to campus and have you spend some time and continue the conversation. And would love to hear your, impressions of a new administration as we move forward. And just to reassure you, Jon, as of today, there's only 1,349 days till the next presidential election. So you have some time before you have to start the next book. I thought I'd let you know that. So
fantastic. And look, thank you all of you. And, to all of you, well done, Amy and Laura and the rest of the academic staff for keeping the show going in difficult times. And particularly to the students, I bet you can't wait to resume normal student life. So thank you very much indeed for inviting.
Well, we thank you to get your perspective, on truly what was an unprecedented election. And, I encourage everybody to get the book. There's so much in there. I do want to thank Dr. Laura DeNardis for her opening remarks and being such an incredible partner with the School of Communications and the School of Public Affairs. The Sine Institute loves having you with us. I want to thank our producers, Matt and Charles, who work so hard, and the rest of the team on campus. And Jon, we're just going to look forward to bringing you back on campus.
Can't wait.
Make sure you get the book. I know we will never run out of things to talk about, Jon. So thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.